Okay, today's daf for Shabbos is Nazir daf Yud Beis Nazir 12, and today's daf Yomi says the Gemara Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef Amar Rabbi Yochanan HaOmer L'Shlucho. If a person says to his agent, say, go out the Kadesh Leisha Stam. He says, go out and betroth for me a woman, but he doesn't say which woman. He says, listen, I trust you. Go out, find me a wife. Guess, and then the guy who he asks to go find him a wife, his lawyer, he appoints a lawyer, he appoints a buddy to go find him a wife. The guy dies. So you don't know who he ended up marrying. He doesn't know who his wife is. Because we say now he's going to be prohibited to marry all the women in the world. Why? Basic presumption is Chazaka shliach osa shlichuso. The presumption is that a person who you ask to do something is going to do it. The agent does his agency. What a beautiful idea that a shliach osa shlichuso. The whole world, we often spend time not believing in people, but now we say the presumption is you ask a person to get to do a job, the presumption is they're going to get the job done. And so, since you asked him to get to do the job, the Kivan the Parish way, since he didn't say specifically which wife to marry, he doesn't know who actually this agent betrothed on his behalf. And so therefore, for this reason, we're going to say that he has, we don't know who his wife is. And so maybe he ended up marrying somebody, and now if he tries to marry somebody else, it's actually a relative of his wife, and so therefore he can't do it. Tosos asked the question, when Tosos says, well, if that's the case, then everybody should be prohibited to marry everybody else in the world, because maybe this random woman who you want to marry was actually betrothed to this man. And we don't, and so therefore Tosos asked the question, then nobody should ever be able to get married. So Tosos says this is actually just a kanas, that we're penalizing this person because he didn't take marriage in the proper manner. He didn't approach in the proper manner. But anyway, so that's the presumption that if you ask somebody you appoint an agent to find yourself a wife and to marry her for you, and then the guy dies, you can't marry anybody else in the world. So someone to say, well, if that's the case, it was so dangerous when Avram appointed his servant Eliezer to find the wife for Yitzchak. What if Eliezer would have died? And then Yitzchak would never have been able to marry anybody. And then there would be no Jewish people today. So someone explained, well, that's why it says that Bikesh Lavan Lakoras Hakol. That's why it says that Lavan wanted to kill everybody. Because if Lavan wanted to kill Eliezer, which what Rashi tells us he wanted to do, well, if that's the case, then there would have been no Jewish people, because Yitzchak would have been unable to marry anyone. Anyway, the Gemara challenges this idea. So this was the halacha that was taught by Rabbi Yochanan. So Reish Lakish challenges Rabbi Yochanan. He says, what about from the fact that if you have a pair of birds, you have a pair of birds is called a cane, this pair of birds. One is for an olah, one is for a chatos, if you're a zav, yoledis, or a mitzora. And if you have this pair of birds, and you haven't specified which one is an olah, which one is chatos, so let's say you have one of these birds, sheparcha, goes that one of them flew off into the world. So one of them flew off into the world, or it flew amongst the sin offerings, or one of them died. Well, then it's no problem. Yikach zugul sheni. You could just take a second bird and pair it, and then the first bird, and it wasn't designated, so you don't have to be concerned about what it was. But if this bird had already been specified, and we don't know which one flew away, the olah or the chatas, then in takana. Then we can't fix it, because why can't we fix it? The reason why we can't fix it is because we don't know which bird flew away, if it was the chatas or if it was the olah. And the olah and the chatos have different halachos with respect to how you apply the blood, because the chatos, you sprinkle the blood below the chut hasikra, below the red line of the mizbeach that goes around the altar. Whereas the olah, you press the blood of the bird on the wall of the mizbeach above the chut hasikra. So we don't know how to bring this offering in. So if it was specified, and we just don't know which bird is the one that flew away, you have no takana, and so therefore you have to take different birds. You have no choice there, and so therefore so therefore you can't save that other bird. And as a result of this, we see that by a kamu furashes, nevertheless, we say we only disqualified this bird, but all the other birds that are in the world, mituknan, are okay. But we say, why? Why don't we say that the one that flew away was maybe an or a chatas, and now all the other birds have a concern that maybe they're this or there's chatas, and therefore you can't bring any bird anymore as an or a chatas. So, therefore, under these circumstances, because this is the case, the Gemara says, the Gemara is asking the question, why don't we say that every case here is maybe it was one of these birds? So the Gemara says, Amarle, so Rabbi Yochanan says to Reish Lakish, Kamina Ana. So Rabbi Yochanan says to Reish Lakish, there's a mistake in your analysis. What's the mistake? I said my case that if you send the agent to marry a woman and you're not sure who she married, you can't marry anybody. I said this case by a woman. Kamina Ana by an Isha. I said this case with respect to a woman, because this woman is what's called kavua, and she's like fixed in her place. And we have a principle when it comes to kavua. And why is the woman fixed in her place? Because we have a concept called kfuda basmal panima. That is, it says in Isaiah that the glory for a woman is to be inside the house, and so therefore she's not moving from the house. She's fixed in her house, and so therefore she's kavua. And we have a principle called kavua kamersal mechsadami. A principle from Chulin that if you purchase a piece of meat from a restaurant and you don't know if the restaurant was, even though 9 of the restaurants in the town are kosher, we're going to say that since you bought it from a fixed place, we look at it as though it's a 50-50 chance, and therefore you can't eat from the meat because maybe it was not kosher. But amrisli but you said to me, Isura deny it, but you talked to me about a case of a prohibition where it's moving. Deny it, it's moving. Meaning to say this bird flew away, and so therefore it's a case of Ruba Parish, and called the Parish me Ruba Parish. We're going to say that it's the majority of birds in the world. And so therefore we're going to say that the majority of the birds are not this or this, not this, and we can rely upon the majority there. If you want to say here also, with respect to the woman, it's also a case of night. That the woman is moving. She's going to go from place to place, and she's not found in a specific place. The Gemara says, "Ve'emor," or maybe you'll say, "Veshuka ashka f'kidish." Maybe he didn't betroth this woman in the house. He found her in the marketplace. We can say that nevertheless, it's not similar to the case of the birds. Why? Hasam hadra lenichusa. But Gabi Kain mi hadra. There, in the case of the woman, she was hadra l'nechusa. She went back to the place where she was resting in the house, which was the place of the fixed place. But with respect to the birds, Gabi Kain, or the bird that flew away, mi hadra, does it go back? It's going to fly throughout the whole world and never has a fixed place that it's going to go back to. So the Gemara says, so that's the distinction that Rabbi Yochanan responds. And that's why he says all the birds in the world can be still permitted, whereas all the women in the world would be prohibited. The Gemara says, in this case of Rabbi Yochanan, the Gemara is going to add on to it. And Amaravo, Moda Rabbi Yochanan, even though Rabbi Yochanan says this law, that all the women in the world are prohibited, Moda Rabbi Yochanan be'isha she'ein la bas. But Rabbi Yochanan himself would admit that if the woman herself, that the woman herself, who he wants to marry after his agent died, if she has no daughter, v'lo bas, and the daughter doesn't hurt, and she doesn't have a granddaughter, and she's not the daughter of a woman, v'lo bas ben, v'lo aim, v'lo achos. So she doesn't have any of these relatives, which if she would have had these relatives, this woman would have, if she was related to them, she would have been prohibited. Then we don't have to be concerned that the person, that the agent had betrothed one of the relatives, and so therefore she's going to be permitted. And even though she had a sister who is now no longer married, but when she sent it, she had a sister, and afterwards, and after the agent sent this woman, she had a sister, was divorced. So we have to be concerned. Nevertheless, in that case, Rabbi Yochanan would allow all these cases, because since she didn't have any of the, at the time, there were no relatives who would have been permitted for him, who, if the agent would have been betrothed to them, well, the agent would have betrothed her to them, then this woman would be prohibited. So therefore, in all these circumstances, we're going to be, the laws of Rabbi Yochanan is not going to be applied. My time, and what's the reason? What's the reason why in the case where there was a sister, if at the time she was married, why don't we have to be concerned that maybe the agent betrothed the sister after she was divorced? The Gemara says, because because at that moment where he sent the agent, the sister was married. And so therefore, for sure, the agent didn't betroth her after she was divorced. Why? Because when he was appointed, when a person appoints a shliach, he only appoints him by something which is at that moment possible. But since the sister, who only became divorced after the agent was appointed, at the moment the agent was appointed, the sister was not possible. He couldn't have married this woman's sister, because she was married at that moment. So therefore, at a moment where it was not possible, the agency is not effective at that moment. So therefore, since this woman was married, well, what are we talking about here? We're talking about a case, there's two girls, Rachel and Leah. So now, when Reuven appoints Shimon to do agency for him to marry, Rachel was married at that moment. Then after he's appointed, Rachel gets divorced. And so we're saying that even though the agent has died, the initial man, Reuven, can now marry Leah. Why? Because since Rachel was married at that moment, Shimon could not have betrothed her for Reuven, because at the moment he was appointed, she was betrothed to somebody else. So the Gemara says, we're going to challenge Rabba's law from our Mishnah. To now, didn't we learn our Mishnah? Already Nazir. No, I will go after Nazir. I'm a Nazirite, and I'm also going to bring these sacrifices for another Nazirite. And his friend hears this, and he says, I'm a Nazir, and it's my responsibility to bring the sacrifices for somebody else. And if they both be smart, Megalchan Zed said, they'll bring the sacrifices for each other. And if not, they'll bring the sacrifices for somebody else. So the Gemara says, now let's analyze this from our Mishnah. The second one makes sense, where he says, and I will bring the sacrifices. He can accept his vow. Because Ika Kadma Kameh, because the first Nazirite was in existence before his Nazirus. And so he says, Nazir, the first person was already a Nazirite. And so therefore he says, I'm going to bring this Nazirite's sacrifices. It makes sense. But how could the first person who says, how could he bring the sacrifices for the second person? This second person wasn't a Nazir at that point. So you can't, if we just said that the Shliach can only do those things which were possible at the moment he becomes a shliach, how could he mi'ika basra kameh? The second person was not a Nazir at that time, so the sacrifices were not valid. They weren't in the parsha. So therefore, the Gemara says on the top of the beis on the beis, this is what the first person must have said when he made the vow. If I'll find that he's a Nazir, I will bring his sacrifices. Meaning to say, even though right now he's not a Nazir, if I'll find somebody after the fact who will be a Nazir, then I'll bring the sacrifices. If I'll find the Nazir at all, meaning to say he's not saying right now I'm going to bring a Nazir sacrifices, if I'll find a Nazir at all. And Hachanami, and so too, Hachikamarway, Imishkachas to Migarsha, Kadishli. And also he's saying the Mishalach, let's say in this case, Reuven says to the agent he's appointing, i.e. Shimon, he says, if you'll find that the woman who is right now married will be divorced, Kadisha, you can betroth her. Even if right now she is married. And so therefore, this is a refutation of Rava as a principle. So the Gemara says, no, Amri, we're saying that Rava must really be meaning something else. What does Rava mean? Lo mashvi in shliach el b'milsa dematzi avid hashta. B'milsa de lo matzi avid hashta lo mashvi. So what's Rava saying? Rava is saying a person cannot appoint an agent except if it's something which is possible to be carried out right now. But something that's not possible to be carried out right now, he can't appoint it. And so since the agent right now cannot betroth this woman because she's married, therefore he can't appoint this person to be a shliach to betroth this woman. Will not be possible, even if she'll be divorced after the fact. Okay, so the Gemara says, is that really the case? Well, but didn't we learn Tashma? Omer Apotropis Shalo, if a person says to his agent, Kol Nedarim Shetador Ishti Mikan Ad She'avo Mimakom Ploni Haferla V'Heferla. Didn't we learn in the following case that if a person says to his wife, if a person says to his executor, and we have this case in the Dharm Dafayim base, the person says to his executor, any vows that my wife will make from now until I come back from this place, you should reject. And I might think that these vows are rejected. That the husband can uphold the vows and the husband can reject the vows. And so therefore, since it says Isha, means say only the husband can do it, but the agent cannot do it in advance. That's the position of Rabbi Yoshaya. Whereas Rabbi Yonasan Omer, he says, no, a person, an agent can be an agent, and therefore he's able to reject the vows. So what's the reason why in this case Rabbi Yoshaya says it's no good? Because the husband can uphold the vows, the husband can reject them. But we're not the case. Apotropos Mefer, the apotropos, the executor, can reject the vows. With respect to the husband himself, if the husband himself wants to reject the vows for the future, Tanya, we learned in the mission the Dharm, all the vows that I reject, that you will make from now until I come back, you kayamin will be upheld. But he can't uphold them. But if he wants to reject the vows in advance, harayin mufarim. Let's say he says that they are rejected. Rabbi Elazar says mufar, he can reject the vows in advance. The Chachamim Omrim and the Chachamim say eino mufar, that they're not rejected in advance. Because the Gemara's assumption is Kiyama Rabbi Oshaya. When Rabbi Oshaya says that the husband can't reject the vows in advance, he says it's aliba de Rabbanan. He's saying this according to the Rabbanan, who say the Amri lo matzi mefer, who say the husband can't reject the vows in advance. Moving forward, but we're not for the fact that the husband would say that the apotropos can't reject them. Apotropos having mefer, the apotropos would reject it. So we see that the husband can appoint the shliach to do something which you cannot do right now, and this contradicts what we said about Rava, that you can't appoint a shliach under those circumstances. Gemara says, no, maybe he's only saying this according to the position of Rabbi Eliezer. According to Rabbi Eliezer, who says that the husband, who says that the husband can reject it. So if that's the case, if he's saying according to Rabbi Eliezer, the husband can reject him in advance, then why does he have to appoint an agent to do it? Let him reject it now. Gemara says, Kasavar, he's concerned, maybe I'll forget to do it when I leave, or maybe I'll be upset at that moment and I will not reject it, or mitrino, maybe I'll be busy, and so therefore he appoints the shliach to do it 1 or 2 days before he leaves, and the shliach will reject the vows whenever she makes it. Fine, that's that mission. If a person says Chatzi Nazir, a person says, I'm going to bring the sacrifices for half the sacrifices of a person who became a Nazir. Veshama Chavero and his friend hears this from Amar Vani Nazir, and the person says, and I'm going to bring the sacrifices for half a Nazir. Zeh megaleach Nazir showing. V'zeh megaleach Nazir showing. Then each one has to bring the karbanos of a complete Nazir. That's Divrei Rabbi Meir. V'cham omrim zeh megaleach chatzi Nazir. V'zeh megaleach chatzi Nazir. And the Chum say each one brings the sacrifices of half a Nazir. Amarav. Hold on 1 second. So Amarava, Kol Modim, everybody admits, Kol Heichad Amar Chatzi Karbanos Nazir Olai. Everybody admits that if he would say actually half the sacrifices of the Nazir are upon me, everybody would say Chatzi Karban Maisi, that he brings half the sacrifices. But if he says Karbanos Chatzi Nazir Olai, and everybody would agree that if he says the sacrifices of half a Nazir are upon me, everybody would agree Kula Karbana. He has to bring all the sacrifices. My time, I don't Nazir. It can't be a Nazir halfway. It's fundamentally impossible to be a Nazir halfway. A Nazir represents somebody who's totally committed. Where are they arguing? They're only arguing about in the case where it's the lashon and the language of the Mishnah. Meir Savar, Meir's in the position, Kivin the Amar, Hare Alai, since he says it's upon me, Ligaleach. Since he uses that language, I'm going to bring the sacrifices. That means at that moment he has to bring all the sacrifices. And when he says half the Naziros, at that moment, he realized he can't reject that possibility anymore because we say we follow the first language. The rabbi said no. Harei came along with Chatzi Nazir, so we say under those circumstances he only brings. Under those circumstances, that's why the Rabbanan say that the Rabbanan say under those circumstances he has to bring their one language, and so therefore he only brings half the sacrifices. All right, we'll stop here. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to address them.